We're going to hear from three speakers today. This is very much the big picture about data centers. So this is thinking about it sort of from the global and talking about the environmental impacts, talking about a bit about tech as well and the impacts of big tech. And then we've got another webinar coming up. We'll be drilling down more into the detail of Scottish policy and what's happening in Scotland. So I'm going to start. I'm really grateful to Julie Bolthouse for joining us. Julie's come, she's in Virginia, where it's about lunchtime. She works for the Piedmont, is it you can say how you pronounce it, Piedmont Environmental Council, and she's the coordination of the organisation's advocacy on state and local policies to promote smart growth and climate action, while conserving and preserving the natural resources, local food system, history and beauty of Virginia. Julie holds a bachelor's in fisheries science and watershed management, and she's also got a degree in urban and regional planning, which is of great interest to us, of course, as APRS, because we work a lot on planning. So that is an area where I think we've probably got quite a bit in common there, Julie. So I'm going to pass on to you. It'd be great. Please do introduce your organisation a little bit further, because we obviously don't know so much about what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. Appreciate being heard on the other side of the ocean or the pond. So I'm going to share a little bit about our work in advocacy around data centers. But before I dive into that, first I want to introduce myself and my organization. So I'm the Director of Land Use with Piedmont Environmental Council. As you mentioned, our mission is to protect the lands and waters of the Virginia Piedmont while building stronger, more sustainable communities. We cover this small region of Virginia. So it's just, if you know where the nation's capital is, DC, we're just to the west of that. A lot of our northern portion of our region is the suburbs of DC, and then it goes down to Charlottesville, if you've ever heard of the University of Virginia, UVA, that's where that's housed. So we didn't get into data center development because it was, part of our mission necessarily. It was because it threatened everything that we worked on within our mission. So we've existed since 1972. And as data centers started to really explode in our region, and we'll talk about it here in a minute, we have the largest data center market in the world in Virginia. We realized that this was an unavoidable issue for us because it was threatening all of the work that we had done for the last 50 years on conservation, watershed protection, air quality improvements, and climate advocacy. All of that work was under threat from what we were seeing from the data center industry. So what I'm going to go over today is just kind of the trends that are happening here in Virginia, just so you have a little bit of background. The broken system that we have might not be the same broken system that you guys have. I really truthfully don't know. And then the data center reform, and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions. So this is a picture of one of our hyperscale data centers in Ashburn, Virginia. It's AWS. It was actually built in 2016. Honestly, it's a smaller hyperscale data center compared to the ones that we're seeing built now. This facility, as you can see, has no windows. They're the big concrete boxes. Inside of them is data halls. Inside those data halls are racks and racks and rows of racks that are filled with servers. And those servers are processing all the compute and storage, and everything in our digital age is going through those facilities. That means they need a whole lot of electricity. A single data center can use as much as a town's worth of power. They also need cooling, and that cooling can come in different forms. It can come from air cooling, or it can be evaporative water cooling, or it can be a closed loop cooling system that might use smaller amounts of water, or it can be a glycol-based cooling system, which is not losing very much water at all. Doesn't need to be topped off, but every like 3 years. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we're actually seeing happen in Virginia in terms of that water, but that's part of the cooling need of the facilities. They also are completely fenced in facilities, and they're fairly huge, as you can see in this picture. So they don't really fit into a walkable kind of community. It's not really a space that you probably envisioned wanting to live next to because it's completely uh, separated from the pedestrian environment, separated from the community, and doesn't really provide any community assets. All right, so with that, we'll talk about the markets around the globe. Virginia has, as you can see, the largest IT load in operation, about 3 times the size of the next one down, Beijing. I'm sure on here somewhere is your area. I can't find it though. Oh, there's Dublin at least. That's close. So you can see it's a huge amount of data center capacity goes through Northern Virginia. And we are increasing. We are one of the fastest growing markets, even though we're one of the oldest, in the United States. So the pink dots on this map, we've been tracking all of our data center development. So this is a map that's created by my organization, Piedmont Environmental Council. We actually pull this data from the land use filings in each one of the counties. So we confirm that there is actually a data center application filed, and then we track it. And if it has the square footage of the site, we track that as well. And so the pink dots on this map are the existing data centers that are on the ground, which there's a lot of. And then the red dots are all the ones that are either approved and unbuilt or proposed. I will tell you the vast majority of those red dots are already approved and unbuilt. So you can see they're popping up all over Virginia. The big cluster to the north there is that Northern Virginia market that we were talking about. And then this is kind of going down the I-95 corridor towards Richmond. And then there's just a scattering throughout the rest of the state. So currently we have about 60 million square feet constructed or being constructed in the state. And there's another about 300 million square feet approved or in the pipeline. Just for, context, I assume you guys have Walmart supercenters. I believe they're global. I think they're everywhere. I apologize. I'm not a very well-traveled person, so I've never been to Europe, let alone Scotland. So I apologize if I'm speaking about things that are not relevant, but this is the equivalent of about 2,000 to 3,000 Walmart supercenters. I mean, so this is a lot of space in terms of 300 million square feet. And that's just the building footprint. That doesn't include the parking lot, the generation storage yards, and everything else that would be associated with the facility, roads and stormwater management, and that sort of thing. So 300 million square feet of data center growth, it's a lot. And in fact, the energy demand from that is a lot. So this is Dominion Energy's 20-year forecast out till 2045. And as you can see, actually, I need to update that little thing in the side there. The green is actually 2025, and the blue is 2000, or I'm sorry, the blue is 2025. The green is 2026. But as you can see, the growth that we're seeing in our region is absolutely explosive. The gray line on the bottom is the actual peak load in the entire Dominion region. So this isn't peak load of data centers. This is peak load of the entire Dominion area. And so this is a very populated, this is the populated side of Virginia. This is the east coast of Virginia. And so 24 gigawatts is our current peak. We're talking about more than doubling it for a single industry. To put into context, a gigawatt is basically a gas plant. It's a nuclear reactor. So we're talking about at least 33 nuclear reactors or 33 gas plants. And so we have to build this power in some way, shape, or form. And the point is that is a lot of power. It took us 150 plus years to build out 24 gigawatts to serve this entire area. And we're talking about trying to build another 33 gigawatts in the next 20 years. So we have dubbed this a crisis by contract. And the reason we're calling that is because the data centers are approved at the local level. They're reviewed like any other land use proposal. And so our localities basically say, what is the traffic impact? What is the impact to our schools? What is how are the lights going to be designed? What's the impact on night sky and lighting and glare and that sort of thing? what is the revenue that this facility might be bringing into the locality. And that's how they assess it. What they don't look at is all the other aspects because these facilities are unlike other land uses. This is not like approving a Walmart. This is not like approving a hotel. This requires an astronomical amount of power, and that means that there's implications to the grid, and you have to deliver that power. And so that means transmission lines, and transmission lines necessitate right of ways through other people's property. And so, at least that's how it works in the United States. And so they use eminent domain to put these transmission lines through people's property to deliver this power to the customer, which is the data center industry. So that means that now you're actually bringing in adjacent landowners and properties as far out as other states into the impacts from this facility that was just approved by a locality that didn't look at any of these things. There's also a power necessity, as we were just talking about, 33 gigawatts of power. Well, you've got to build that power. And so that means there might be a gas plant somewhere on the grid. Well, that's going to have air quality implications to some other community somewhere. And that locality that just approved that data center did not consider those impacts to some other community from a new generation facility. It has water consumption issues, water supply impacts beyond just the locality approving the site. So they might look at, some of them might be looking at the water that's necessary for the facility. But what they may not be looking at is the consumptive impact of that water usage. So if it is evaporative cooling, what that means is that there's probably somewhere between 60 to 80% water loss in that evaporation. That water just goes up into the sky. That's different than a hotel. A hotel might use a whole lot of water, for example, but that water goes into a wastewater treatment facility and then gets discharged into a local water body after it's been cleaned up. This water is lost into the sky. So that means that it has downstream water supply impacts that go, again, beyond that locality. And then finally, there's a cost impact. There's a cost impact to everybody else on the grid who has to, again, this is how it works in the United States, might be different there, but the transmission lines in the new generation that are put onto the grid, those costs are shared across all the ratepayers. And so that means that everybody potentially has to face larger and higher electricity bills for that power infrastructure to be built to serve this facility. The same may be true for the water system, depends on exactly how the locality has allocated the costs in terms of expanding reservoirs or expanding the infrastructure to serve that facility. Now, again, here in Virginia, our localities have an obligation to serve. This is from the Virginia Code, and it highlights that they have a duty to furnish adequate service at reasonable and uniform rates. And so they basically say, once the locality has approved the facility, we have to serve them. We don't have a choice. We can't say that that was too much. And so this has really led to what I refer to as the tail wagging the dog situation, because the locality approving a data center site is now forcing regional impacts that go beyond their locality and even sometimes beyond the state. In terms of new transmission lines, new power infrastructure, ratepayer impacts across all of the electric service area, which may extend all the way to PJM, which is our 13-state regional transmission operator. So New Jersey is facing higher electric bills because of data centers approved in Loudoun County, Virginia. So this is why we say that it's led to this situation. And just to highlight, that 33 gigawatts that they're planning for in terms of load growth, that's only a fraction of the actual contracts that our utility holds. So our utility has these different levels of contracts. The ESA contract level is where it's closest to actually being brought onto the grid. So that basically means you have a data center, it's built, you've got a substation built, and it's ready to go. We're just turning it on once the infrastructure is all in place. But they hold 48.5 gigawatts of contracts at this point to serve this industry. And so that also means that we've been locked into contracts that have never been reviewed by any state review process. It's all been approved at the local level, and this has led to this huge glut of energy demand that it's going to take decades to even serve in our it's very complex, but yes, it's going to lead to decades of how long it's going to take us to actually serve that demand. And then the question is who bears and who pays and who bears the risk of all of this? Well, that's all of the other ratepayers, because as I mentioned, that cost is shared across all of the rate base, and there's a lot of nuance to how rate making happens, but part of the problem here is that the industry, the data center industry, is the largest customer here in Virginia. So they're able to influence, they're able to enter into private negotiations. They have much stronger leverage. They're able to get discounted rates as an industrial user. And then we have a flawed rate structure that actually incentivized large load users to come onto the grid because they help to spread out the capital costs of new power plants because they had larger base load, and the closer you can get your base load to your peak, the better the economics of gas or any kind of generation facility is. And so that was something we actually used to kind of incentivize. And so that rate structure is still built on that. But that's not what we're seeing now. Now what we're seeing is that the large load customers are driving up that base load so much that they're actually necessitating numerous new power plants and massive regional transmission lines, far surpassing anything that would just help to buffer the peak demand of residential. They're dwarfing the residential demand. And then the high demand is also causing higher capacity costs. It's basically supply demand imbalances. And so the fuel prices that all users are facing are going up. And then those transmission lines that many of them are just serving data centers are again being subsidized, even though they're really acting like distribution lines. So what I mean by that is they're basically just going to a data center site and that's all they're serving. But yet everybody else is subsidizing them, which is not the way we usually do it with distribution lines, at least here. And then that huge risk of what if this is a bubble? What if the technology changes and they don't use as much power later on? What if the power demand that they currently require fluctuates or changes and the load, profile changes? Well, that's a risk borne by all the rest of the customers on the public grid. And that is also extremely concerning because there could be stranded assets, there could be reliability issues, there could be a lot of different things that come from that. There's also a whole lot of community impacts beyond just energy, though, that we're seeing here in Virginia. There's impacts to our parks and trails, there's noise impacts, there's wildlife impacts, all those different things. So I just want to kind of highlight why we feel like this is unprecedented in terms of the type of development. First, it's explosive. We've had explosive development before, like there was a big housing, boom in 2006 to 2008. But there's a lot of speculation in this market, way more than the speculation that we have ever seen in any other type of market, because the speculation isn't just, how much data center, space are we actually going to build? It's also, what are we going to put in the data center space? Is it all going to be AI demand? Is AI going to explode as much as we thought? Is it actually going to be needed in the places that we thought? Is it going to have the same load profile as previous data centers? Are going to be totally different? There's all these things that we actually don't really know, and we're just building in a very speculative market. And then the amount of energy a data center uses is as much as a city, as I said, and they use more generators, backup generators, than any other facility. So hospitals sometimes have backup generators. Actually, they almost always have backup generators, and some factories have backup generators. Schools sometimes have backup generators, but they don't have hundreds of these backup generators that are the size of a train car, which is what we see at data centers. And like I said before, the water usage is consumptive, and so it's lost to evaporation, at least if they're doing evaporative cooling. And so that is a different you only see that usually with like a bottling plant. You don't usually see that with a hotel or any of these other types of uses. And then they tend to cluster, which means that those impacts are cumulative. And so everything starts to really add up because as the fiber gets built, data centers don't just work in isolation, they're communicating with each other. They're very complex beasts. And so you need to, kind of be near, depending on exactly what you're doing. If it's cryptocurrency, if it's AI training, you don't necessarily need to. But a lot of the other types of data center processing really benefits from being near large clusters of fiber and other data centers, and therefore they like to cluster. Okay, so this is just a few pictures. This is a Google data center actually near my hometown of Leesburg. These are the 500 kV and 230 transmission lines that are serving that facility. As you can see, you can barely see it, but there's a little bit of steam coming up from there. Evaporative cooling. Google uses a lot of evaporative cooling. Again, not every data center company does, but it varies based on what type of technology they're using, what type of cooling technology. This is a 230 kV line near a home. We're seeing a whole lot more of these closer and closer, larger and larger lines closer and closer to homes. In other facilities, this is a substation along the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, just kind of showing how our parks and recreation facilities have been impacted. This used to be largely a forested, corridor through Ashburn. Now it's pretty industrial in nature. And you also have the hidden danger of generators. As I mentioned, these are backup generators, size of a train car. This is the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, and the cyclist is traveling beside them. This area is where that Washington and Old Dominion Trail is located. And all these brown dots are basically showing you clusters of generators that are permitted with data center facilities. So right now we have over 9,000 generators permitted in Virginia, and 2,000 are clustered in this one area of Ashburn and Sterling, which is about 2 square miles. So that's a lot of potential air pollution in that area. And in fact, VCU, one of our universities here in Virginia, recently looked at air pollution from data centers and found that data center air pollution may be worse. It rivals, at least, the power plant emissions in our area. And so they are having a very significant impact, not just on the climate, but also on public health because of the air quality impacts. This is particulate matter and NOx that is a precursor to forming other particulate matters which can impact public health. Then you have the water consumption side of this. And this is where it gets a little bit complex because obviously the data center, visibly potentially like the Google data center I showed you, may be using evaporative cooling and you may see the steam leaving the facility. And that is some water consumption. But truthfully, the larger water consumption in the data center space is actually from the power plants themselves, especially if it's gas or nuclear, depending on how the nuclear is cooled, but most of them still use water. And so there's actually more water loss from the power side of this, which is not always taken into consideration. And as I said, it's lost from the system, and that's what makes it different than the water usage of a hotel or an office building, or even really a golf course. I know they love to point to golf courses, and with a golf course, the thing is first of all, a lot of times they use the on-site ponds for the water irrigation, but also the water goes into the ground. It's still not evaporated and lost completely to the system. Now, it's polluted when it goes in the ground. I'm not advocating for golf courses. They're not great for the environment, but I'm just saying the water is not lost. And then you can actually see, because a lot of times the industry tends to cherry pick. And I get it. They've got some good examples. So they point to things like heat recapture at a facility in Paris, and therefore, we could do this everywhere. But there's not a single example of heat recapture in Virginia that I know of. I don't even know of one on the East Coast of the United States. So, I mean, we're not really using heat recapture. It's a great example of no one actually doing it. And you also have examples like, okay, completely closed loop, no water loss systems. And the industry will say, hey, we've gotten away from water cooling. Well, what we're seeing on the ground in Loudoun County is that's not really true. Those red dots, or red stars on this map, those are air-cooled data centers. The purple ones are on the reclaimed water line. The reclaimed water line is maxed out. That basically is the wastewater that's been cleaned up to the point that the data centers can use it. That's been used up at this point. The red ones are air-cooled. But the blue stars, if you actually look at them and compare them to the data centers, they're mostly the new data centers. And the new data centers are mostly using water cooling. And part of the reason is because they can't get enough power from the energy system. And so there's this balance between energy usage and water usage in terms of cooling. And so you are absolutely still seeing water cooling. And then I just want to talk a little bit about just a couple more slides about our coalition and what we've done here in Virginia. We're trying to push back and get some state oversight in our Commonwealth. Right now, we have localities that are continuing to approve data centers, although it has slowed down significantly because of the information that we've put out there and the impacts truthfully coming to roost in the state. So people are actually starting to have transmission lines take their property. They're actually having these generators cut on next to their homes and seeing puffs of black smoke from the diesel generators. They're actually, having gas plants showing up right next to their communities. So all the things are actually happening. It's no longer we're warning about something to come. And so localities are actually starting to say no, but we still have a number that are continuing to approve data centers. And that's why we need this state oversight to really look at those cumulative impacts, those regional impacts, those things that have been neglected to this point. And so we formed the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition, which is over 50 environmental conservation, historic preservation, climate advocacy groups, as well as representatives from communities like HOAs, homeowners associations, things like that. And this is our platform. This is what we're advocating for at the state level. We want to see what we call the 4 pillars of data center reform. We want oversight at the state level, again, to ensure that those regional and statewide impacts are taken into consideration. So in addition to local approval, we also want to see state review. And then we want enhanced transparency around energy usage, water usage, and emissions. We need this information so that we can be better planning and ensure that we have adequate information to make those decisions. And then we need the industry to pay for their infrastructure so that these costs are not unfairly falling on to the rest of the ratepayers, electric bills and potentially, water infrastructure. And then incentivizing sustainability. We want to do this in a variety of different ways, but one of the ones that we focus on here in Virginia is the sales tax exemption because it is such a huge boost to the industry right now. It's reached over $1.6 billion, which is the largest sales tax exemption of any industry. It is the largest in the country. In fact, I believe it's Texas, Georgia, and Ohio combined is what we give away here in Virginia to the industry. So we want to at least tie that to some sort of sustainability standards to ensure we're getting something. We advocate in a variety of different ways. Obviously, that one that I just showed you is state level reform, but we're also working with groups throughout the state on local ordinances, making sure their language really addresses all these different issues that we've covered, and making sure that we engage in the SCC cases. That's basically making decisions about our energy infrastructure. The State Corporation Commission is what that stands for. And outreach and public education efforts like this one, speaking to you guys today, and then also supporting our universities and continuing to gather data and really flesh out the impacts from this industry. With that, I think I went a little bit over time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think Victoria will be able to say in her talk, but I think that the sort of relationship between the planning and the grid is actually very, very similar to the situation here, in that the planning is done locally, but obviously the grid decisions and the impacts are national. So, and in fact, they're beyond Scotland as well, because energy is not a devolved issue to Scotland. So I think that would be really interesting for us to look into. We've got a question actually about evaporative water cooling, which is why is that chosen particularly? Whether it's cheaper. We are hearing from developers they don't like to be told they're going to use loads of water, and so they often would say, "Oh, we're using a closed loop system." Is there anything that you can comment on about the? Do they use more energy? Like, what's? Tell us a little bit about how they choose how they cool their systems.
Yeah, evaporative cooling allows them to reduce their energy usage on the system. And so if you actually read Google's environmental social governance reporting that they do annually, they actually explain that the reason that they're using evaporative cooling is because they feel like it saves more water in the long run by not pulling additional energy from the grid. So they feel like it's a net positive, and they only do it in areas that they feel like are not water at risk, which I would beg to differ because Virginia's in a drought right now. But that's a point of debate. But I think that the issue is it can potentially be better if they're using closed loop systems, but you really need to ensure that whatever, I don't know if we have a proffer system, which is really weird in Virginia, and I'm sure you don't have that. But whatever system you have for conditions of approval, you really need to be telling them this is how much water you can use. No more than that, regardless of whatever technology you want to use. You want to use closed loop? Great, use closed loop. But just this is the amount of water you can use.
Great, that's a really good tip actually, because it's from sort of my point of view. I've been really concentrating on the energy because of the impacts on climate and the landscape. But actually, I think we do need to look into the water too. So I've got a question from me, which is so this energy that use are other industries and businesses rising up to say, hold on, and joining your coalition, say that this is impacting on us? Because I feel like other business and industry that might have energy requirements could be an ally in this argument to decision makers.
I would agree with you, but the problem in Virginia is that the economic development that happens in our state is data centers, data centers, data centers, and more data centers. And so it's like you can't separate economic development from data centers because all of the economic development in the state is tied to data centers in some way, shape, or form. It's really because they've been growing here since the 80s, truthfully. Now, all that being said, there is a growing voice of kind of opposition to being tied into the rules that are falling onto data centers. And what I mean by that is, for example, during Dominion's biennial rate case, where they put that's our utility, when they put data centers into a separate rate class. You had Walmart and you had the shipbuilders in the state and a couple other large energy users basically going, hey, wait, we don't want to be wrapped into this. This is not fair to us. We've existed here for a very long time and never had a problem. Why are you wrapping us into this? So that's where we are starting to see them break off a little bit. But I think in other states where it's a newer industry, you probably would get more support than we get here.
Okay, and just quickly, that David's asked about discarded heat to serve heat networks. I think I heard you right in saying that there really weren't any in Virginia and probably not on the whole of the East Coast of America. Is that true?
Yeah, as far as I know, I've never seen an example of it here in the United States. They talk a lot about it. There's been lots of webinars about it, but it's partially it's because of the way we build in the United States. We're a very sprawling, country. We also don't have central heating networks, and so there is no easy way to actually recapture that heat without it being extremely expensive.
I think that's the case in Scotland. We've seen them saying that they're going to do it, but there isn't any evidence that they've got a plan. So I'm going to introduce Donald now. So Donald Campbell is from Foxglove. He's director of Advocacy. It's a tech justice nonprofit, and it's working on issues of technology and fairness. And he's got 2 decades of experience in communications policy and advocacy. So I would hand you over to Donald. I hope you can tell us all a little bit about what Foxglove do, because I'm seeing you quite a lot in the newspapers and the media at the moment, which is fantastic. So over to you, Donald.
Sure. Thank you, Kat. And thanks, Julie, for that. That was really fascinating and a lot of issues we've got in common, I think. So really helpful to hear about that. Let me just share a few slides. I'm just going to rattle through these because I'll try not to duplicate too much of what has been said already. Can we see that all right? Great. So yeah, I mean, first of all, just a brief outline of who Foxglove are. We've been around for about 5 years. We're a very small organization. Top line stuff is we work to make tech fair for everyone. So we work in a few different areas as well. For example, um, labor rights and union activity, which big tech has done a lot of union busting over, whether that's Amazon warehouse workers or content moderators around the world who have been mistreated by tech companies. We also work on kind of monopoly power, but specifically, obviously, for today, it's kind of a relatively newer area of work for us. We've been looking at it for maybe a year and a half, around the environmental impact of major tech companies, where data centers is obviously one of the most pressing issues. At the moment, we're focused on UK data centers, and so I thought useful just to say why. Yeah, we're obviously, it feels like hearing from Virginia Hills feels like a bit of a kind of warning from the future almost because the way things are in the UK, I think there's a kind of still, despite the work, including the great work from APRS, there's still a kind of lack of maybe public and even political awareness about the impact of these and how they're taken into consideration, how the policy looks around them. There's very significant government support, certainly at the UK level, for really pushing forward the construction of lots of data centers in the country. It was a big part, as people might remember, of President Trump's visit to the UK at the back end of last year. The UK government's also unfortunately very too close to big tech firms, and it can often be a bit hard to tell the difference between their talking points and the government's talking points when it comes to the positives and the upsides of a lot of this. And there also, yeah, there's a very large number of very large facilities in the planning system. So some of them are over a gigawatt. I think there's one in kind of Newcastle area, and one in Lincolnshire in England that are kind of over a gigawatt. And yeah, for a kind of UK comparison on that, I think we had some very good examples already. But I think if you stick Torness nuclear power station and Hunterston B while it was still running together, you get about 1.1, 1.2 gigawatts. So that's one facility that will use the complete output of both of them. If you then scale that up, they're not all on that scale, but there are anything maybe in the region of 100 to 200 in the planning system across the UK. It's quite hard to get a complete overview. I think there's a bit of a clearer picture on how many in Scotland. And I think, again, I might be corrected by someone else on this call, but I think in Scotland there's some very large ones as well. I think the proposal for Ravenscraig is maybe about 600 megawatts, which is over half a gigawatt. Um, so yeah, really big potential impact coming from these. I think there was some recent figures out from Ofgem possibly that said on the UK level, the number of connection requests they've had would be just the UK's energy demand again, or electricity demand again, rather, in terms of what it would do. Um, what's Foxglove doing? We've got an approach that involves legal action and also public communications, advocacy, and campaigning. So I'll run through a case that we had quite a positive result in just earlier this year. It was a challenge under the planning system to a proposal at Woodlands. It was 90 megawatt data center. That is still very big by the standards of what we have in the country already. It's just the scale is so massive with some of them that, yeah. So Foxglove, we brought a case under, I should say, just for the record, I'm not a lawyer, so I will be reading out some things about this, but not necessarily getting into all the detail. Town and Country Planning Act to the High Court in England, a challenge to this proposed data centre. The local authority had rejected it initially, and then it had been called in by the UK government and their decision had been overturned. I think the UK government's done that on about 3 occasions so far. In terms of the kind of key points we were making in this case, it was about the government's failure to carry out proper assessments of the environmental and kind of resource impact of the data center. They said it wasn't necessary to have an environmental impact assessment, so one wasn't carried out. There was about 1 paragraph, I think, in the Secretary of State's decision notice, even covering some of these environmental points. They didn't adequately consider, electricity demand, carbon emissions as a result of that, or potential water needs. And we argued that the failure to do that meant the decision shouldn't have been granted. In January, actually, I think it was only a few days out before the first hearing was meant to happen, the government did concede. They admitted they'd made a serious logical error in coming to their decision, and agreed that the decision should be quashed, which is overturned. And the specific point they said they had got wrong, though there were a number of points raised, but the specific point I think they conceded was around not putting in place kind of almost like concrete measures to hold the people planning to build the data center and the people who would run the data center to commitments on how to deal with its climate impact. So I think that's kind of important, because the developers may make all sorts of nice sounding, not even really promises. They might say a lot of nice things when they're at the planning stage of, oh, don't worry, we will use renewable energy for this, or we will ensure it doesn't use water in its cooling system, or is a closed loop, or is non-water technology. If there's nothing to really hold them to that, if there's no teeth in the process or the decision, then it's kind of meaningless. Also, because quite often comes back a bit to the speculative point, the developer of the data center won't necessarily be the organization that is then going to run it. I think that's true of the one that Edinburgh, I'm sure someone else will talk more about Edinburgh Council, but I think that's true of the one that Edinburgh Council rejected recently. But you also see it in quite a few places across the UK. There's a sort of, slightly kind of speculative move towards trying to get permission for these things, and then they would be maybe handed over to someone else to run them. So what the developer says, they won't necessarily be held to. That's the outcome with the legal case. In a slight complication, the government's conceded, but the developer who were involved as an interested party have not, and have said they want to continue to fight it. So there could be further hearings in this. It's hard to know at this stage how it will go, but I think that the key point is that the government has conceded they got it wrong. Moving on to some of our other areas of work, like I said, just trying to build that kind of awareness of just how staggering the environmental impact of these facilities could be. We've done various bits of research and tried to put out reports around impact in terms of emissions, impact in terms of water use. So we've done bits and pieces there. I think trying to make it kind of comprehensible by comparing it to other things we already know can be quite useful. These are the emissions that result from these places are sometimes several times the amount you would get from an international airport, or a British international airport. So that's quite significant. I think those are just a couple of other examples there, really looking at what we did some work trying to look at what kind of, if some of these projects go ahead, what are they going to do to the UK's efforts to meet its carbon emissions reductions target, which is also an issue I'll come back to at the end, which has come back up through one of the parliamentary committees in London that's looking at the issue. I think the other thing we've just been finding is that there is quite a lot of information out there if you know where to look, but it's kind of going a bit unnoticed. So there's a lot to be said just for doing what you can to put it in front of people and in front of decision makers a bit more. And then just finally to conclude, sorry, that's not a very friendly slide at all, is it? But kind of policy developments at the UK level that are significant. I'll take the bottom one first. So the Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons has just in the last, I think just last week, announced they're going to be conducting an inquiry into the environmental impact of data centers. Now they're a Westminster committee, but I think because they've done this out of some work they were doing around looking at the work of the Climate Change Committee and carbon budgets, I think there could be a bit of crossover relevance between the UK and Scotland there. Sorry, without wanting to get into the weeds too much, the Climate Change Committee that sort of advises the government on carbon budgets advises both the Westminster government and the Scottish government. So that's very positive that they're looking into that. They've quite strongly taken up some of these issues with the UK Energy Secretary around, have you really considered impact of data centers in your projections and carbon emissions and so on. So that's a really important area, I think. The other part of this, and this is more England specific or England and Wales specific, I think, is this national policy statement on data centers that the government has said they're going to be publishing for consultation in the coming months. So we've recently joined with some other NGOs in the area to call on the government to ensure that that policy statement includes real concrete environmental protections. I won't read them all out there, but I'd be happy to share more on that after the call and share the letter as well. So it feels like, those are the two kind of, in terms of, Westminster policy aspects, the two kind of key things to be keeping an eye on and working with in the coming couple of months. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald. I've actually got so many questions that I feel like we probably just need a phone call, because it could just get a bit of a chat. But I really wanted to ask you about the kind of trade agreement that there was between the UK, that tech kind of trade agreement between the UK and the US, because I think it fell apart at some point. But my assumption is that all the stuff that benefits the US will still happen, i.e. the data centers, but perhaps not the investment in actual stuff that could benefit the UK. I mean, what's your interpretation of that situation? And did you see a sort of uptick in kind of interest in data centers when that kind of discussion was going on in terms of US investment in Britain?
Yeah, so there's the tech prosperity deal, I think is what it was called, that was kind of announced again, during that state visit by Trump last year. I'm not a huge trade deal expert, but the impression I got of it was that it was quite high level. So I don't think it was really involved necessarily that many very solid commitments. And yes, like you say, there was then some reporting in the following months about the US, I think, saying they weren't happy with going forward with all of it. I think because they were unhappy maybe with the Online Safety Act, some of the UK legislation about tech regulation more widely, which the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk aren't happy with. And as a result, because of that very close link between the Trump administration and the tech firms, they're kind of trying to use kind of leverage against that. So I think that's where it is. But I think I would agree that it doesn't mean it's all off the table now. A lot of these. So, for example, there were some big announcements around that one I mentioned that's at a place called Campbell, which is near Blyth in the kind of Newcastle area. That's got a lot of US investment in it, and so far as we can tell, is still very much going forward. So, yes, I think it's still, yes, unfortunately, it all still kind of full steam ahead on the data centers, regardless of that. And the government has been proceeding with policies like the NPS that I mentioned, but also some regulations they passed through Parliament, UK Parliament in December, to effectively allow data centers developers to bypass the local planning process and go straight to central government if they want to. And sorry, there was a second. I can never remember two parts to a question. There was a second part about.
No, I think that actually covers it.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you a follow-up, which is I just can't get my head around why politicians are so into data centers, because they evidently don't have any jobs associated with them to speak of, and they are extremely costly. are they just looking at raw numbers of investment? Whereas, if you were to invest in a factory, that includes all sorts of jobs and all sorts of ways that money goes to local communities and businesses and all the rest of it. Are they thinking? Have they got an old-fashioned way of thinking about investment? What is it? I just can't get my head around why they like them so much.
Yeah, I can't completely understand it either. I mean, I think on the jobs point, I think there are some very inflated jobs figures out there that the government has announced, and we did try to dig into some of them a bit, in fact, and found that the reality was just much, much lower than what they were putting out there. So they were saying, there will be thousands of jobs associated with this data center. I think they were then asked in Parliament, where did you get this information from? They said, we got it from the local Northumberland County Council. We then asked Northumberland County Council where they got the information from, and it came from the developer. So a lot of all of these estimates around jobs are built, it seems, on top of the developers' figures. There was a good piece in the FT kind of recently, kind of unpicking all of that. So I think that's part of it. I think maybe, the story that comes out of the US is that there's huge economic growth as a result of the AI boom. And so maybe they're looking at that and assuming that if they can just do that in the UK, they will get the same result for the economy, which I think is not a good way to look at it, but without getting into all of that. And I think there seems to be, I think, to be honest, it just feels like they've bought a lot of the industry hype. And you could start getting into things like, these are firms with an incredibly well-resourced lobbying operation, and with the likes of the Tony Blair Institute, who are very influential with the current government, or certainly have been saying, this is the way forward, you've got to do this, you can't get left behind. That means you've got to build data centers as the basis of your AI industry. And there are all kinds of reasons that doesn't stack up, but I just don't think, it doesn't feel like the government's either seen fit to ask those questions or maybe even wanted to ask those questions.
Thank you very much, Donald. I'm going to move on to Victoria now. We'll have a bit of time, hopefully, at the end for extra questions. So if people do think of additional questions for Julie and Donald, please do put them in the chat. We'll have a little bit of time afterwards. So Victoria, thank you for coming. Victoria lives in Edinburgh. She got in touch with APRS. She joined APRS. And in fact, I'm so delighted when anybody joins that I emailed her to say, how did you hear about us? And thank you so much, because that's stopping us going bankrupt. So thank you very much. And that's a little nudge to anyone who hasn't joined yet. Please join us, because we literally are always on a knife edge of funding. So please do. We'll have someone will put a link in the chat but anyway, Victoria joined and I said, why have you joined? She said, I'm really passionate about data centers. Turned out that she's an energy and sustainability expert. And so we've met a couple of times, really excited that Victoria can join us and share some of her experience. So I'm going to pass over, Victoria. I don't know if you could say a little bit more about what you do. I know you're a social scientist, but you're also interested in the sort of data. So please do introduce yourself. Thanks, Victoria.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen real quick. Yes, so thank you so much, Kat, for inviting me. And I'm really excited to talk after Julie and Donald's contributions. So a bit of background on myself. As Kat said, I'm a climate and energy expert. And nowadays, my expertise is usually in climate and energy policy in the global south, but I actually cut my teeth working at Ofgem. So this has really brought me back. I've had to open parts of my brain that hadn't been open for a while. And I reached out to Kat because I was sort of like the conversation we just had, so shocked by the misinformation that was spreading really wildly about data centers. And I was also surprised by the government's very gung-ho, fairly uncritical approach. And so I was mostly interested from my perspective where the numbers don't lie about climate and energy. So I'm going to talk you guys through kind of the proliferating scale of these data centers at a global level, why data center companies and speculators have targeted Scotland in particular, and talk you through some of the very common myths about energy and data centers so that hopefully everyone on this call who are fighting against their own data center fights have a little bit of ammunition in their back pocket to basically push some of these developers and push some of these, basically fairly speculative planning applications. So first off, let's talk about climate. So from a global perspective, the impact of these data centers is expected to be enormous. The International Energy Agency projects that over the next 10 years, the amount of electricity generation required to supply data centers alone is going to triple. And you can see here in this chart to the left that that's going to have direct impact on the amount of CO2 emissions that we're seeing from data centers. Because even though renewables are growing, they're still expected to grow at pace. In the end, they think that over the next decade, renewables are only expected to meet half of the demand. And so we're going to see demand that's going to have to come from coal-fired power plants, gas generation, what have you. Obviously, it depends where you're sitting, right? So looking at these numbers, data center companies, speculative investors have looked at Scotland and has targeted Scotland as an ideal location for data centers because of our significant wind power supply. The argument being the wind power here is free of CO2 emissions. So if we put our data center in Scotland, there's no CO2 emissions really affiliated with this, right? So let me tell you which part is true. It's certainly true that Scotland has a lot of wind, and we have very little CO2 generation, very low carbon intensity of the energy generated in Scotland. So the UK has its net zero target of reaching net zero by 2050. Here in Scotland, we have a slightly more ambitious target of 2045. And the reason why that target is possible is because we have very low carbon emissions from electricity here in Scotland. So this cute little graph on the left shows the major sectors and their carbon intensity here in the country. And you can see electricity is actually one of our lowest sectors in terms of carbon emission. This is very unusual. Most countries find electricity far on the left-hand side of this chart. And the reason why it's so low is a number of reasons. First, we've seen coal closures. So we closed our last coal-fired power plant in 2016. You can see a huge drop-off of the energy intensity of our emissions. And also you can see over the last 20, 25 years, we've seen huge decreases in the amount of gas-fired power that we've also been producing. And this is for a number of reasons. Increased energy efficiency is certainly one of them, but also the huge number of renewables that have come online have allowed us to use less and less baseload, or really just turn on our power plants less often. So then it must all be true. We'll just stick our data centers in Scotland and we don't have to worry, right? Why can't renewables simply scale to meet data center demand? This was Kat's provocation to me when she asked me to speak. And there's a couple of reasons, but first let's just talk about scale. And let's also talk about what do we mean when we say scaling renewables. So I'm sure Kat will say at some point, but here in Scotland, if a data center says it's a green data center, this has planning priority. But there is no firm definition of what a green data center is. One possible definition includes having on-site renewables. When I say on-site renewables, I mean, can you fit a couple turbines onto your lot? Can you put some solar panels on your roof? And it's very clear that the scale of the energy consumption required does not meet any on-site renewables that could ever be put on these lots. So this is just an example from our kind of recent experience with the Gyle data center that got overturned. So the Gyle data center has a nameplate capacity of 213 megawatts. Somebody had asked in advance how much of the nameplate capacity is actually utilized on average. There are not super good data for this. I think Julie pointed out a lack of transparency, but I was able to find a white paper that suggested maybe we're looking at 50 to 75%. So maybe you're looking at a kind of daily use of up to maybe we want 100, 150 megawatts of capacity available, right? Well, the average Scottish wind farm is 36 megawatts. So you'd have to put at least 3 to 4 of the average Scottish wind farm on the site in order to have on-site renewables that were available. The largest solar farm in Scotland, I couldn't even find the average was too small. The largest solar farm in Scotland is only 13 megawatts. So you can see putting solar panels on the roof, putting a few turbines on the lot is not going to come anywhere near the electricity generation that's required for these sites. But, we're also talking about other kinds of scale. Can't you just put more wind turbines up across the country and solve the problem that way? And here you've got two issues. The first is intermittency, and this is where we're going to get nerdy. If you are a nerd like me, I highly recommend energydashboard.co.uk/live, where you can see all of the energy that's being produced over the last 24 hours at all times. So this is a cute little chart I pulled up last week where we had a very windy day on the 23rd of February. And the reason I point it out is because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how our energy system works. Yes, renewables have intermittency issues. The wind is not always blowing. The sun is not always shining. Those intermittency issues do cause fluctuations in the amount of CO2 produced by the grid. That doesn't mean that renewables are useless. They have huge positive impacts reducing our CO2 intensity, but you also can't assume that renewables are always available to meet your peak demand. So the little story I want to tell you here of the 23rd of February is you can see that really clearly, if your demand is high enough, the intermittency of renewables makes a difference. So if you look at the top chart here, which is our gorgeous little chart of the energy mix we had over the 24 hours there, you can see wind is that middle piece, that sea green piece. It was very windy. The wind was pretty consistent, but we are in the middle of the winter. So if you look at the orange piece, which is solar, you can see at 5 p.m., the sun went to sleep. However, at 5 p.m., everyone came home, popped the kettle on, threw a load in the dishwasher, and we actually see this demand spike happening at the same time that solar is decreasing. And so what do you see? You actually see small increases in the blue, which is gas-fired power. Now, I think to the average eye, this doesn't look like a huge spike, but if you look below to the gray chart, that's the CO2 intensity. You can see how even this additional demand that was put on the grid at a time when the renewables weren't there to meet it have huge CO2 impacts. So the story here is not about the uselessness of renewables. The story here is that if you keep adding demand to the grid, at some point you have to turn on a gas-fired power plant, and those emissions are real. The final point I want to make about grids, one more image for you guys, is that Scotland is not an island. And in fact, when it comes to energy, Great Britain is not an island either. So I think I get incredibly frustrated when people say our grid CO2 intensity is very low in Scotland, because we do not have a Scottish grid. We have a national grid. We are an integrated part of a whole. And so when wind energy is consumed in Scotland, it is not sent to England and Wales. When it is not sent to England and Wales, someone's got to turn on a gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant. Additionally, we are not even a Great Britain island. You can see on the left here that we are regularly importing energy from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, and that we are regularly giving energy to our neighbors in Northern Ireland, and Norway. So we are actually part of this constant interconnected system. And so to say that the energy that is used here doesn't have impacts on these other pieces of the puzzle, if you're interested in carbon emissions, is patently untrue. The final, and honestly, I think perhaps most important point here, is that here in the United Kingdom, we do not actually make enough electricity to meet our demand on an annual basis. On average, we import 15 to 20% of our energy. So if we are seeing demand increases, we will be importing more energy from the continent. That is an energy system whose energy mix we have no control over. We also don't have so much control over the pricing there. And so you can see there's all sorts of price implications to increasing our demand, certainly carbon emission implications. And it just feels like a very untrue story to say, well, there's a lot of wind power in Scotland, so we use the wind there. It's no harm, no foul, right? No, we're part of an interconnected system. Eventually, you're turning on a gas-fired power plant. But what about other solutions? We were talking a little bit, Kat and I, about batteries. And why can't batteries just fill the gap when wind and solar aren't available? Couldn't we have an entire grid where we don't have to worry about Victoria asking about gas-fired power? And the reality is just that the battery storage that's available is not to the scale that these hyperscale data centers would require to be entirely CO2 free. So the biggest ones that are coming online in the States are about 30 megawatts. So we know that's only meeting, off the top of my head, I don't know, like a third or less of the requirements of our data center. If it's operating at 50 to 75%. And they're really only designed to soften peak load, to kind of give the national grid a heads up if they're going to continue to have increased demand while other sources of energy are decreasing. Basically to be a good neighbor, but realistically, it's to ensure that their customers are able to access demand at all times. This is like Julie's excellent point about the backup generators. That's essentially the role that these batteries are serving. And in fact, we can see that really clearly because we aren't seeing with the proliferation of batteries less and less energy needs, we're actually seeing an increase in gas-fired power being built at a time when globally we're supposed to be transitioning away from fossil fuels. I've never seen such an increase in the states of new planning permissions for natural gas-fired power plants. So just in the past year, the states have seen 3 times the number of gas-fired power plants. And here in the UK, we also have data centers constantly requesting more links to the gas grid. And Ofgem have pointed to data centers needing more gas-fired power as one of the points for this. So we're definitely going to expect to see a lot more carbon emissions coming with these different data centers coming on. And, I can't answer the big question of what happens when data centers are competing with all of our different needs. And I think Julie did a great job of outlining the different environmental impacts, local impacts, impacts on communities. And I think I was particularly struck, and maybe this is a little too specific to our Edinburgh situation, but I was particularly struck by the council's response around the community's needs and how these data centers are not good neighbors. But the piece I wanted to leave on is that obviously we're going to see these huge changes in Britain's energy use because of these data centers, and this is something Donald brought up, but it's going to have an impact on bills, and I think this is something Julie alluded to as well. And if we're thinking about this from an energy justice or a climate justice perspective, it seems a little crazy to me that under UK's current plans, data centers are going to have to pay less per kilowatt hour, while you and I are going to have to pay more per kilowatt hour because they're there. I mean, this is a super clear justice issue. And at least in my experience talking to counselors, something that I think they're comfortable with, especially uncomfortable with, especially during the cost of living crisis that we're all living through. As we're talking about people's energy bills, this is a no-brainer. There's no reason that they should be paying less and we pay more. So those are my major points. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So I actually have been doing a little bit of looking into the battery storage stuff, particularly related to the AI growth zone, because I think that's the one we really need to be looking at the moment in Scotland, because it's got the backing of the UK government. There's potential money behind it. So they are saying that they're going to have batteries of 2,400 megawatt hours. So we know that most battery storage, the very large battery storage that are going into Scotland at the moment through planning, are around 500 to 1,000 is the biggest megawatts, and they are for 2 hours. So let's say a 500 megawatt for 2 hours would be 1,000 megawatt hours. So essentially 2,400 megawatt hours is 2.5 times the size of a 500 megawatt battery storage. And we know they cover about 25 hectares. So we're talking about batteries covering an area of about 1.25 kilometres squared to serve this data centre in Lanarkshire. That's what they're saying they need. It would cover 5 hours of their operation. It would in fact cover only 4.8 hours of their operation. So it doesn't take you across those wind-free days where there could be no wind for 24 hours, 48 hours, or perhaps a couple of days. So, it kind of doesn't add up at all. And it just means we're going to be covering kilometres squared of countryside in battery storage, which is by its nature hard standing. So, and given this AI growth zone is going to be on a greenbelt site, it's of extreme concern to us as a countryside charity. So that was just what I've looked into. I've got a question for you, Victoria. How do we best make the case that renewables aren't able to power these? Because it comes back to us all the time when we speak to people about it. It's like, but we've got loads of renewables, and it links a little bit to this question from R.S. Kingsman, who's asked about curtailment. So, we at the moment in Britain, when there's too much wind and it can't be transported south or used, places are being paid to turn off, and it's costing billions of pounds. So that seems to be a really strong argument that politicians are taking, that data centres are a good idea. So what would your strongest sort of pushback on that be?
I mean, from a energy policy perspective, the problem is our transmission lines, not the data centers, right? I mean, the data centers are a different problem. I don't think we have too many renewables on our grid. That's my 2 cents. We actually have a lot of capacity for more. I agree that our systems are outmoded and the solution is to improve them. The data centers are still just an additional demand. And as we've seen, the scale of that demand is wild. I think if you were to ask someone to do an estimation of how much wind is wasted, I don't think it would reach anywhere near the scale of these data centers. And perhaps more importantly, to the point, the planned curtailments or switching off of these wind is not 24/7. These data centers require 24/7 electricity. And to the point of the kind of tail wagging the dog, their customers' usage is what drives their energy needs, not how much energy is on the grid. They can't go up or down in the amount of energy that they're demanding based on how much wind is available.
Yeah, thank you for making that really clear. I've got a question I'm actually going to put to Nikki, I'm afraid. It's about environmental impact assessments. It's from a group who are in the Borders. I think it must be the long form. I don't even know how to pronounce the place. The one in the Scottish Borders. So they have been requested to do an EIA, and the question is, how thorough is this? Is there a site visit, or is it a desktop assessment?
So I don't know. There'll be two stages to it. There'll be a screening process. So presumably Scottish Borders have done the screening process and told the developer that they want them to do an EIA. So the developer will then probably pay consultants to do the environmental reporting. So somebody will go on a site visit and do some desk-based research. But it may not be a big site visit as you're envisaging. But those reports should be publicly available and you should be able to see them on the planning portal as soon as they're submitted.
They're invariably thick as anything.
Yeah.
In every sense of the word, in that it's obfuscation principally. So you might find, if you're extremely skilled at identifying the hidden impact, you've got to go through 248 pages or something like that. And because they're paid for by the developer, then and the consultants are not wanting to get to put critical environmental impact statements into the public domain, then of course they're inevitably advocating for the development and saying it's fine, it's going to be all right. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I've got an additional question for Nikki, which is, to what extent do you think that EIAs will bring in the energy, the climate, and the water impacts of a data center, or are they more looking at those local impacts, like Julie was saying, that you would normally have if you're building a supermarket or a housing estate?
I think the system wasn't designed, the EIA system wasn't designed for data centers, exactly like Julie's was talking about earlier, that it was more about the footprint and the impact on any sensitive sites. So I think it remains to be seen, and I think we need to try and encourage Scottish Government to ensure that the emissions and the power and the water impacts are taken seriously at that stage of planning. But I think we don't know at the moment.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is, if anybody else have got questions, could you put them into the chat there? Because otherwise I'm going to just continue asking questions, because I have infinite curiosity about this, having done quite a lot of reading about it. I'd just like to say to folks that Nikki will post the link in the chat, but we're going to, hopefully there'll be quite a lot of media out tomorrow about a website that we've made, which shows you where all the data centres are in the planning system in Scotland, and how much, there's all sorts of links to planning documents, there's maps, there's as much information as I've managed to find over the last few months of research. And I've put it all in one place, and we're launching it tomorrow, so you can get a little heads up. So Nikki, if you could put that in the chat, that would be fantastic. And do raise your hand if there's anything you want to say, actually. There will be a recording of this, so not to worry, Mary. And if anyone has got a question, please do raise your hands, because we've got about another 10 minutes until a little roundup, and then we'll finish. Oh, we've got one from Julie. Julie, please speak.
So it's not a question, it's more of a comment / discussion starter, but we've been having the same issue in terms of messaging around renewable energy here in Virginia. There's been a lot of conversation, even from the environmental community, pushing that we can meet this demand with renewables. And we have a two-party system here, Democrats, Republicans, and this has really created a very challenging environment because the Democrats, many of them, have bought into the idea of all we need to do is meet the demand with renewables, while the Republicans are fine with fossil fuels. They're both upset about affordability issues, but then they just kind of put out solutions like data centers are going to build their own power without explaining what in the world that actually means or what that actually looks like. And so one of the things that I just kind of want to highlight is that messaging around we're going to meet this energy with renewables is really it's very much a PR kind of messaging with no actual action matching up with it. And so that's one of the things I think you need to highlight too, is that it's not just can we do it or can we not? The industry isn't trying to do it. So it's like, okay, they can sit here and they can say, hey, we're committed to renewable energy and we're going to buy RECs and we're going to do this. And they do a little bit of that. But when it actually comes down to it and you have policies in front of them, like, okay, Virginia legislator currently has a bill in front of them. It's SB 619 here in Virginia that says, okay, to get your certificate of operation, you'll commit to 100% renewable energy and battery storage, and you'll match with the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and you'll do all these things. The industry is actively opposing it. And so it's like, you can't you can't do these things if the industry doesn't actually buy into it. So I think that's another aspect of this, is it's like they say these things, but they're not actually doing them.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'm just going to look for other hands. Otherwise, I'm going to give you a very tiny preview of, oh, we've got a question from David. Small modular reactors. Yes, facetious stuff with our small modular reactors, which actually have to be the same size as Torness nuclear power station to operate them. So I'm going to give you a little preview of what we might. Oh, Nikki's going to speak. Nikki.
Oh, I just had a kind of comment come question, I suppose. Last week at the first hustings for the Scottish parliamentary elections coming up, a Conservative MSP, Scottish Conservative MSP, said he supported the idea of data centres in Scotland because he liked the idea of his data being kept in a data centre in Scotland rather than anywhere else. So I just wanted, so my knowledge of data centres is not very great, but I suspect that is not the case as what is happening with his data. But it does kind of indicate the level of political understanding that there is out there, and it's maybe something to factor into what's going on.
Thank you. I wonder, can I put that to Donald and then to Victoria and see if Julie also might have something to say about that?
Yeah, so I suppose that's part of the kind of digital sovereignty is what it's often called, discussion that is happening quite a lot in Europe and being kind of carefully ignored, it feels like, by the government in the UK. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the challenging things, which is that, to zoom out a bit, obviously there is a need for data centers. So we're not kind of, I don't think anyone on this call is kind of absolutist and saying no data centers, no more data centers to be built. But the ones in the kind of planning process, the sort of hyperscale ones, are not about having places for all of us to keep our emails. We've already got that. They're about the sort of projected or expected hugely demanding kind of AI applications. So it's just a bit of a mismatch between, but that's quite a difficult thing to tease out about, what exactly are these going to be used for? Which are the ones that we really need as our kind of critical infrastructure and which are the ones that are highly speculative and are mostly going to be used for defrauding people using generative AI, you know. So it's haven't really cracked that one entirely, to be honest. But yeah, it's an interesting point.
I mean, that seems to be really, really key. I mean, I've done a bit of reading and it looks like AI data centers that are training models need so much more computing power. They are actually physically different. But I mean, I would defer to experts. So I don't know whether, Victoria, do you want to talk about that? And then I'll move on to Julie.
Yeah, I can say a few words about this point because I think I also have been looking at the data centers from like a sovereignty angle, or at least to your point, Kat, about cui bono, like who's benefiting from these? Why are politicians so bought in? Um, because the reality is when you go on your phone and you have Google Auto AI the answer for you, it's not pinging the closest data center. Like it's not about the locality of the data center. The data center could be halfway across the planet that's doing these operations. And so other people have thought more thoughtfully about what this means for neo-colonialism and digital colonization and things like this. But going back to the energy perspective, I think about what that means for the system operator. Because, you know, as I showed you my cute little chart that I love to look at every day, the national grid knows when everyone goes home here and turns their kettle on. The national grid does not know the most popular time to use generative AI in Islamabad, right? So it's going to add a new demand to the system that could be having usage spikes at unexpected times or at times that the network is completely unused to. So that's a much more technical problem, but it's one that I could foresee.
Thank you. And over to you, Julie, if you've got any wisdom from across the pond.
No, I have nothing I can add on to that. That was a great answer from Victoria. So.
Okay, that's great. Well, what I'm going to do now is just draw it to close a bit with a big thank you to our speakers who have been absolutely astounding, because we're all feeling our way here. It's a new area that I think that all of us are trying to get our heads around, and it's really good to have some people with more experience in it to talk to us. We're going to be looking at the net. We've got a couple of events coming up. We've got one on Thursday, the 5th, and Victoria will be speaking again at that. This is in person. So we're going to be meeting specifically about the Edinburgh proposals. But I know for a fact, I've heard from people that they will be travelling up from Ayrshire, from the borders to come there. So we really welcome everybody to come, not just people who are going to be coming there from to talk about Edinburgh. So we're going to make it as good, as much as a workshop towards the end as we can, where people can perhaps meet other people interested in it in the areas that they're living in. So that's on the 5th of March in person. It'd be great to see you. There'll be time for coffee afterwards. We're going to have an hour of chat, an informal gathering afterwards. So please join us for that. At that, we're going to hear from, as I said, Victoria. We're going to hear from Jane Herbstritt, who's Global Justice Now, to talk about tech campaigning and why this is important from a global tech justice point of view. And we're going to hear from Ben Christman of the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland, who were involved in the challenge around the EIA for the Edinburgh Data Centre. Then we've got another webinar on the 25th of March, which is data centres and the planning system. So that's a fun time for you to talk to Nikki, to Ben again, specifically about EIAs, and to me about planning policy in Scotland and what we really need to tackle in terms of dealing with this from the top down, in terms of the changing the policy environment to make that different, because at the moment it's not ideal, the situation we've got in the policy realm, but also from the bottom up is how do we challenge each data centre as they come through the planning system. So that will be really practical, really good. And then finally, a networking day and a learning day for data centre and countryside campaigners. So this is going to be tied onto our AGM. So there'll be a small amount of time allocated to the AGM, perhaps about an hour, which is not, you don't have to come to, but we do encourage you to come and listen to what APRS has been doing over the last year. And then we'll go into some workshops, some talks, and we will have planners there who will really help us get our heads around some of the key questions and the detail you might have about what about your data center application. So that is on the 25th of April. So you can sign up for all these on our website, and I really look forward to meeting you as we kind of grow this. So thank you very much to everybody, and feel free to sign off now. And the speakers, let's stop for a second at the end and just say hi and do a little debrief. That'd be lovely. Okay, thanks very much.
Kat, there's a question about the Thursday event, whether it will be hybrid or not, but I think it probably won't. Is that right?
So it's not hybrid, but we plan to record it. It's just too difficult to actually make it hybrid, but we will record it and put it online. And we hope for the best, that will be recorded. But often with these events, you have to rely on the technology. So we'll see. When will the bubble burst, David? All my strategy, David, for the whole of this is waiting until, just hold off these data centers until the bubble bursts. And hopefully will work. Victoria, did you have something to say about that?
No, I
Good,
just was
right.
hoping it would burst sooner rather than later.
Yes.
I bet Julie
Fingers
is
crossed.
really hoping that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Goodbye.